Now, today's video thumbnail may seem dramatic, but we need to talk about Bungie. Specifically, the relationship between us, the community, and the individuals who contribute to making the game we play day after day, season after season, year after year. Because recently, things have become a little worrisome for us, and we're concerned that our once beloved studio is going down a dangerous path, a corporate path, turning the core player base, the people who love this game, against them. Now, you may be wondering, why do we have such a grave outlook on the future of the studio? Listen, we've made a video about the future of Bungie, how it's never looked brighter. I'm super hyped about Lightfall and everything else, the end to the Light and Darkness saga, how that's not even going to be the end of Destiny, the potential Destiny show that we're going to be getting. And we've seen it with shows like Edge Runners and Arcane, how much this benefits the game itself. Hell, we're looking at a Cyberpunk sequel coming out due to the success of Edge Runners. But what we're talking about today is not necessarily Destiny, but Bungie, the studio that just got $3.6 billion. The studio that used to be openly transparent with us and communicate with us about pretty much everything between TWABs, CMs, and individual developer interviews. There were lots of avenues Bungie used to interface with the player base. But I am starting to see a trend. And it all started after we first heard about the Sony acquisition of Bungie earlier this year, which takes us to the problems. To give you a quick refresher, earlier this year, Sony announced that they would be acquiring Bungie for $3.6 billion. And if you paid attention to any studio acquisitions, you know that this is a boatload of cash for a studio that only has one active franchise. It's not like Activision where there's like a number of games and dev studios. This is just one. So that's a chunk of money. Now, the deal didn't actually finalize until mid-July, but even back in February, the gears were already turning. Our concern here, though, is Bungie losing its soul through this deal. And some of you may be wondering, was there some big change that actually brought us to this conclusion? Not really. It was actually just a number of small changes that have been happening over the year. Let's start with Bungie's most well-known method of communication, the TWABs, as our first example. Now, we cover the TWABs every single week. We've been covering it now for like, what, 5 years, 4 years? The TWABs have been Bungie's primary way of communicating with the community. However, here recently, and you've probably noticed this over the past month, the TWABs have been skimpy. It's been lacking relevant information. We would get like a short TWAB once in a blue moon, and I can even point this out to like last year. We had like one tiny TWAB during the week of Thanksgiving that was following 2 weeks of massive, and I mean huge TWABs full of both changes to both abilities and weapon sandbox. And we were even made aware before that tiny TWAB that we were going to be getting a short TWAB in the following week. Recently, though, it feels like every week has been a toss-up. The question that comes up, are we actually going to hear more about the actual changes to the game this week? Or is it just stuff going over Bungie's store, recap of old updates, known issues, that quite frankly don't address the most pressing known issues and concerns that players have? We basically had to beg Bungie this week to give us some information on Gerfalcon's Halbreak. Even just one line in the known issues section of the TWAB saying, hey, we're working on a fix. It's really complicated. We'll let you know when it's ready. Even that would suffice. But instead, it's not even listed in the known issues. So we're strung along week after week wondering, hey, Bungie, do you know that this exotic that we paid for this past season is still unusable? And this is not the first time this has occurred. And this is becoming a pattern, and I brought this up in last week's TWAB. Remember Point Contact Cannon Brace? Disabled. Or Quicksilver Storm? Also disabled. 3 exotics, new exotics that came with this season. I know Quicksilver Storm is tied to the annual expansion, but regardless, the disabling of exotics is really getting out of hand. But that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is the lack of communication on this. It makes me think Bungie doesn't even see that these are issues. And then, of course, when these supposed fixes rolled out for these exotics, such as Cannon Brace, it comes back as complete garbage and quite possibly the worst exotic in the game right now. Now, listen, I'm not a game developer. Obviously, I'm not the one sitting there manipulating the code or the dials, but as a content creator who's covered this game for years, all I can say is the communication on this front has been weak, and this is not a good look, Bungie. When over half of the new exotics released this season are unusable, and each week we see fixes to seemingly irrelevant problems, it makes us question Bungie. Why? Eager's Edge. This is a sore trait. An enhanced version of it was recently dealt with. And I know DMG just put out a tweet or a number of tweets regarding this exact issue, and I appreciate DMG addressing this. The problem is last week's TWAB should have addressed this issue. We didn't even know about the enhanced Eager Edge nerf until yesterday, until the patch notes rolled out. To summarize what he said though, enhanced Eager's Edge could be used to skip encounters, break mechanics, and cause issues with the game. We always seek to call out changes like these ahead of time to keep you in the loop. Some changes can be developed rather quickly, but held for future hotfixes and patches with a bunch of weapon and ability changes. There wasn't a rush for this specific change. It just happened to be assigned to this hotfix. We're talking to the team about timing for changes like this moving forward as well. Again, I appreciate DMG for addressing this. And some of the girthiest TWABs ever put out, Dylan himself wrote, and they are chock full of amazing sandbox details. But let me just point out something here. How come something that slightly benefits the player gets addressed quicker than anything else? We have Enhanced Eager's Edge, which, by the way, I didn't even use to break mechanics or encounters. I think most people used it for speed running. Maybe it does. I don't know. I'll have to look up some clips to see what exact mechanics it breaks. But how come things that have any type of benefit to the player gets immediately dealt with? But then we have issues of like the duality dungeon or other bugs in the game that have yet to be dealt with, which should be at the top of the to-do list. Bungie has not been honest with the player base regarding hotfix changes, and this has been happening much more frequently as of late. A great example is Dead Man's Tale. Bungie stated in the TWAB on August the 11th that DMT wasn't quite landing the hipfire cowboy rifle fantasy as strongly as we wanted, so we reworked it to lean more into the fast-firing hipfire. What this should have said is that we nerfed it into the ground because screw your cowboy fantasy. Oh, and the increased damage that it does inside of PvE? Actually, no. We nerfed that too. It's just the way we worded it sounded like it could have been a buff. Better lawyer up, man, because that's the only way you're going to be able to discern these patch notes. Now DMT is incredibly weak in PvP and in PvE. It has been massacred. Cowboy fantasy, gone. Sky Cowboy, destroyed. And this is not the only example. Not by a long shot. Two things that have rubbed me wrong way since they were released are Airborne Effectiveness and skill-based matchmaking. You want to talk about changes that don't help the health of the game? Both of those have been changes that have not helped. This season is a great example of that. First, we'll address the big one, skill-based matchmaking. Considering it's all fresh on our minds, Bungie shifted matchmaking this season in the control playlist away from connection-based matchmaking. This has now been shifted to skill-based matchmaking. The community pretty much stands 50-50 on this topic, on whether or not this has made Crucible better. Now, I'm not going to argue whether or not skill-based matchmaking was good or bad. I don't like it. I've played less PvP this season, but at the same time, there's some other contributing factors to that I'm going to get into. What I do want to comment on is how Bungie addressed the feedback. About a week after the changes went live, Bungie recapped some of the statistics in the control playlist and led off in the first week of Season the Plunder, 140,000 more hours of Control have been played than in the first week of Season the Haunted. And we had around an 11% increase in the total number of players playing Control. The hours played and the 11% statistics both go hand in hand. You have more players, so you therefore get more hours played. It's a no-brainer. The problem with these stats is that there is zero clarification on how many total players there were playing Season the Plunder versus Season the Haunted. Was it the same? Was it an 11% increase in total player count? Or was it the fact that you actually added Epic Games here recently, which brought in a slew of new players? You also had the Lightfall reveal. There was a number of things contributing to why people probably tried out a PvP match. This dialogue sounds corporate to me. It's, hey, this is actually really good. You're just experiencing things way differently than what the statistics show us. And I like to call these cherry-picked statistics. Now, Bungie actually did reveal that player quitting actually rose from 8% to 12%. Meaning more players were quitting. Bungie's solution? A quitter penalty in a control playlist, a casual playlist, a playlist that was never meant to be comp. We now have because they're so committed to skill-based matchmaking. This is a band-aid solution to this problem, fellas. It just shouldn't exist in the first place. So you may be asking yourself, okay, well, why would Bungie make these changes in the first place? What's the reason? Wouldn't these changes hurt total player counts? Look, this is where Bungie probably has some analysts behind closed doors that's saying, hey, listen, we need to make these changes because overall, this is better for the health of the game. Maybe these analysts are tied to Sony in some way. Who knows? I'm speculating. But Bungie did just recently partner with both Epic Games and Fall Guys with the launch of Season the Plunder, and this has brought in a bunch of new light players. And they want those new light players to have a good experience to then purchase the game. Fortnite is a very PvP-focused game, and Bungie wants to attract that PvP audience. So in turn, they want to make matchmaking easier for new and lower skilled players. Sure, this may hurt player counts for your hardcore audience, but it also may easily increase the retention of new players who are jumping into the Crucible for the first time. Granted, this is all conjecture, and we're not exactly listening in on Bungie corporate meetings, but I have seen this same scenario play out before in the past, where Bungie thought this change or that change was better for the overall player base, and what did they end up doing? They pissed off everyone, and people quit left and right. Look no further than year one of Destiny 2. Double primary system, extended TTK values, 4v4 in all Crucible game modes, watered down loot grind, and what did Bungie have to do for the entire year afterwards. They tried catering to the casuals, and what did the casuals do? They eventually quit because that's what casuals do. In the process of trying to cater to casuals, they pissed off the hardcore player, and Bungie had to commit for the rest of that year, all the way into Forsaken, that hey, we are targeting the hardcore players here. We know our veteran players is what puts food on the table. The problem is that these changes, this is hurting the hardcore player. This is making our gaming experience worse. And look no further than Airborne Effectiveness. Now, originally when we read about Airborne Effectiveness, we thought, okay, this sounds pretty good. It was the way that the TWAB disguised the patch notes, right? It sounded like it was gonna be a buff. It honestly sounded like, okay, exotics are gonna feel much better when you shoot them from the air. But everything else should be the same, at least at base. And the dialogue here was like, you'll have ways to build into it. It sounded really good. It added depth to the game, or so it seemed. And for a hardcore player, this is what we like. We like builds. We want to have control and manipulate even the smallest of stats. The problem? You can't really effectively build into Airborne Effectiveness. There's only so many ways to do it, and we've already had an entire breakdown video of this. And overall, Airborne Effectiveness, especially within its first iteration, was terrible. It was awful. It changed gunplay for Destiny for me. And now you have builds, and I know I'm responsible for one of these, which is the Dead Messenger Warlock build, where we slide in, we shoot a grenade launcher shot off at folks, and then proceed to follow with our melee. Why is this build so effective? Well, primarily because people can't take to the air. You can, but you're gonna be inaccurate. Whereas in the past, I'm not saying that this build wouldn't have been good, but a lot of Guardians would have took to the air and dealt with that rushing Dead Messenger Warlock much better. Now, this change was made similar to why skill-based matchmaking was included. It was to target hardcore PvP players and essentially nerf their playstyles. They want to give everyone a fighting chance here, and having that player learn how to jump and shoot at the same time, that was too much. Too much skill. Get the hell down, man. Boots on the ground. But again, it's not the change that concerns me the most here. It's the way it's disguised in TWABs, in sandbox patch notes. It's honey-coated words about how good Airborne Effectiveness would be for the overall PvP sandbox, when in fact, it was terrible. And this used to not be a thing that happened in the past. I felt like patch notes, TWABs, everything, they were very black and white. And honestly, patch notes to some degree are, but the TWABs themselves seem to just disguise things in a way that is trying to sound over-appealing. And of course, we're naturally seduced by what we're reading in hopes that these changes are good, because we assume that changes Bungie makes are for our benefit, the hardcore players' benefit. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and just say everything Bungie introduces is terrible. I think honestly, the ability and sandbox overhauls that we had just before the 30th anniversary was one of the best Bungie has ever done. The clarity, the balance. I know that the super changes annoyed some people with the different tiers, but this brought way more variety inside of Destiny's PvP and elsewhere. Having the ability to custom tune ability cooldowns is very helpful for build crafting in both PvE and for PvP. And it set the stage for the 3.0 overhauls to our subclasses. But the beautiful thing about all of this was that Bungie was upfront about the reasons behind these changes. And that was a clarity that we all appreciated. Now, I know we've covered a lot of issues today that have occurred over the past year, and I want to wrap things up by circling back to what I believe is the reason for these changes. At the beginning of the video, we mentioned how all of these issues started to arise after Bungie announced that they were being acquired by Sony. And the biggest question you may have is, what does a studio acquisition have to do with TWAB and hotfix shortcomings? Bungie is not just a studio anymore, it's a business. And I suppose the better term is corporation. It's a far cry from a small studio that brought us Halo back in the early 2000s, which, by the way, is not necessarily a bad thing. Not at all. It means the studio is growing, which means the game that we're playing is growing. There's many benefits to having a large organization making a game like Destiny. And we've seen it with stances against cheaters this past year, lawsuits being waged against websites that distribute cheat softwares, being spearheaded by Bungie's legal team. Granted, it took a lot of complaints before they made it a priority, but regardless, Bungie made it a priority. They've added more and more staff since 2020, now sitting at over 800 employees and still growing. Granted, I'm sure a good portion of those staff is devoted to marketing and production for the new IP for Bungie, so not all new hires necessarily translate to more Destiny developers, but still, growth is happening. But what happens in these situations where you have tremendous growth and the bigger Bungie gets, the more they begin to act like a corporation, not because they want to, but out of necessity. So where does that leave us? Well, as I said earlier, there are huge benefits to Bungie growing in size. More people working on Destiny means more content for us players, but it also means that work required to connect together the progress of the different teams themes and package that info accurately into a TWAB or a hotfix becomes much more difficult. Less info is fine throughout certain times of the year, but going silent and pushing out constant corporate lingo, while it may look good for appearances, doesn't service us, the players, at all. I can't help but also wonder if the toxicity on Twitter and the attack on the developers by members of the community has also led to less communication about these topics. Hence why we made our video way back when, pleading with the developers to not succumb to the negativity, as the majority of the player base very much appreciated the transparency from Bungie. It sucks that element even exists, but it doesn't excuse just leaving us in the dark or even being intentionally deceived. Patches are going to be controversial. Bungie, you don't have to perform a song and dance every time you get ready to ship one of those controversial patches. However, if you're nerfing an exotic or a perk, don't have us do verbal gymnastics to understand whether it's a nerf or a buff. Set our expectations properly so we don't get upset when the exotic you said was getting slightly tuned and is now completely useless. But more so than that, realign yourself with what the core player base of Destiny really is, because I am seeing multiple updates occurring that don't seem to have your true players' hearts in mind. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.